So, welcome to the AI in Education podcast, Ray. How are you today?
I am fantastic, Dan. The weather is warm. It's just an enjoyable day. And I'm on campus today. I'm on campus with the UNSW team.
So, just for this episode, we've got a special guest today. But before we actually start and introduce Peter to the call, I think it's very important that we acknowledge the land and the owners and traditional owners of where we actually are meeting on today and listening to this podcast. I'm on the Gadigal land myself in Sydney, in Australia. And I think it's really important because today we're going to be unpacking some of the cultural awareness issues that we need to think about when we're talking about Gen AI and the I suppose, stand on the shoulders of lots of the work that Indigenous people have done in Australia throughout time, being some of the first nations globally in the world who have developed a lot of innovation and technologies around science, engineering, and maths for the years. And I think Gen AI is the next step in that area, and it often offers a lot of opportunity for those communities, but also creates a lot of peril for communities and Indigenous and rural and remote communities globally. So today's episode, we're very, very excited to welcome in Peta-Anne Toohey from Indigital. Now, I was at South by Southwest, Ray, a couple of weeks ago, and Peter was one of the amazing panelists we had on the education panel there, which is fantastic, in the part of the charitable organisation. And
It was another FOMO moment for me, Dan, because I saw you put up the photos on the stage and
yeah,
it's like, my goodness, what an amazing
and
panel you had there.
Peter was one of the ones that stand out for me there because we really explored a lot of Indigenous discussions around generative AI. And welcome to the pod, Peter.
Warami, Dan, and Ray, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I'm Peter. I'm an Aboriginal woman with connections to the Gundungurra and Darug mobs of the Upper Blue Mountains. And just before I kick off, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're recording this on the lands of the Gadigal people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and recognise that their connection to this place was never ceded, and pay honour and respect for the incredible work that they've done historically and still today to care for country in this area. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm keen to yarn about culture and about tech as well. So, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. No problem at all. And thank you for that amazing welcome. And I think your title within Digital, a social reciprocity manager, jumps out. And it's a bit of a tongue twister there. But can you explain to us what your actual role is at the minute?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a tongue twister. It took me a long time to master it. But so my role at Indigital is I lead our social reciprocity research. So what that means is that basically working in the impact and evaluation space in the company. And so my role, I joined Indigital about 2 years ago, and my role hadn't been created yet. So we really kind of built it up from scratch. And what we recognized was that in the impact and evaluation space for mob, it can be quite violent, to be honest. It's quite extractive, it's very linear, and it doesn't really always measure success or value in the ways that community see success and value or how they define that. So, yeah, we've built a social reciprocity framework, and that really looks at how we can have wins for country, for community, for Indigital, and for our clients. And it's really rooted in the very opposite of that. It's rooted in relationality. So it's really based around relationships. And it's also founded around a lot of co-design and co-creation and actually co-evaluating with community as well. So that's a really key element of how we measure impact at Indigital. I work primarily up in Cape York across our 4 communities, and I lead the research for our Caring for Country through Technology program. And what that really basically does is we work across each community to build digital skills, whether that's through augmented reality, VR, around like digital storytelling and things like that, or whether that's around Caring for Country initiatives, so looking at different types of conservation technologies that mob can be upskilled in so that they can possess those skills within community and really drive some, self-determined outcomes for what the future looks like up there. So, yeah.
with those technologies you just mentioned there, it sounds fantastic. What have you seen generally, in terms of this generative AI wave that seems to be hitting everybody now? What is the impact having on some of the regional and remote communities?
I don't think generative AI, like that doesn't come up a lot in what we do up in the Cape. And the reason being is that there's obviously, we know there's a huge skills gap between mob and, well, there's a digital skills divide there. I feel like, down in city areas, like we're using ChatGPT for everything. It's built into our businesses. It's a constant kind of element of everyday life. But when you go into remote communities, it's a completely different world. And I think that a lot of people don't understand just the vast difference of what community life is up in some of those areas. So, in terms of it being used, I don't think it's ever come across through my research up there that it is being used up there. However, that's obviously an issue because generative AI is increasingly used, as I just mentioned, like in every aspect of our lives, and it's only going to continue to grow. I think it was from based off some of our research, it was 88% of community members that we surveyed want to be able to use technology to teach language, law, and culture. However, only 22% of them understood what AI was or what machine learning was. So you can see that there's a huge
Mm.
skills gap up there. And this kind of jumps to like a question further down, but I'm just going to jump into it here now anyway. So there's obviously like this skills gap, right? But there's also this massive access gap. And I think it's because when we look at like communities and when the government or whoever it is wants to fund a program, often they're just like throwing bunches of money into these programs that haven't been co-designed with community. They don't often happen actually on country in these remote communities. And it's almost like this band-aid solution that we continuously do. And that's why we don't see very good stats coming out of closing this digital divide. So I think that's what marks our program a little bit differently, is that we spend a lot of time coming into community to really understand, A, is this tech even welcomed in community? We do that kind of digital skill upskilling on country, like where we meet community where they're at, where we are able to go to the elders to be able to teach these types of new skills. And then through those like processes and that relationship building, you do get a better sense of what technical skills are needed in those areas and what are some of the issues that they're facing or the goals that they're trying to achieve and what would be the most appropriate technology to bring in. I think that's why generative AI, it feels like a foreign thing to talk about when I think about the work we do up in the Cape, because that's a conversation for maybe a few years down the track. And maybe not even that long necessarily, but you have to find an entry point with communities so that you're using technologies that they can feel, see, sense, and it's hands-on learning, if that makes sense, because it's through these kind of processes. And that's why I like working with augmented reality has been great as in terms of an entry point. Because you're seeing elders walk into a room, right? And it's like, Arnie will go like, oh, I don't touch computers. And she's going, hell no. But then within the space of 3 days, she's on the Surface Pros and she's, creating her totem story on using 3D modeling software. And then she's turning that into an augmented reality asset, right? And she's recording a story to it. And this is a form of like cultural preservation, right? That's a really good entry point, but jumping straight into generative AI wouldn't be like the right cultural fit to exposing mob to these new technologies and how they fit in within community.
Can I just put a couple of checkpoints into the conversation? Because we've talked about remote a number of times. Now, Dan and I are both from not around here. Dan is from a very small country in Europe. I'm a medium-sized country in Europe. But if I think about the geography, you talked about the Cape. So I'm in Sydney. If I'm going to fly to the nearest city, it would be Cairns probably, which is 3-4 hours of flying. And then if I hop in a car and say, okay, I wanted to get to the Cape, what am I talking about? I mean, we're talking about a couple of hours drive
No,
out
it's
of
probably,
Cairns.
I think it's like a 8 to maybe 14-hour drive. However, you wouldn't have to drive. You can go to Weipa Airport. And from there, you can get to the communities. So the furthest community we work with is Arakoon from Weipa, and that's about 2.5 hours drive. But it's on the western side of Cape
Wow.
York. Yeah.
Okay. Right. And you're way, way closer to like Papua New Guinea than you are to probably even to Cairns, certainly to any nearest state capital. Like it is genuinely,
For
truly
context,
remote, almost like a
yeah, we
different
got
country.
caught at Weipa Airport last week actually, and they were going to cancel our flight. And it was quicker for a pilot to come from Thursday Island than it was for a pilot to come from Cairns.
Right. And so when we're thinking about technology in that case, it's at the end of the data line almost. Like we can just plug in, we've got Wi-Fi everywhere, but is there basic access or is everything having to go through satellites?
So I'm pretty sure there are underwater cabling up there to allow for Wi-Fi, but it's pretty shocking. So they solely rely on Starlink up there. And yeah, I remember one of the first times I went to Arakoon actually. It's one road in, and you can see all this mob like sitting on chairs in the main street, and that's because that was the only place that they could access internet. So it's vastly different to our realities of, you know, like I just recently moved in with my sister, and she didn't have internet, and I thought that's so odd, you know, because it's just like this element of everyday life that we really take for granted, but it is not the lived reality for a lot of remote communities. And so, yeah, like these are some of those kind of differences between life in urban areas and remote communities. And so, yeah, they're important elements to the discussion. So,
and how about mobile technology then as well? Because sometimes in other countries, like I know in Africa, the internet sometimes is not available, but often mobile signals and mobile has managed to penetrate those areas. What is your experiences of that?
It's good unless the Telstra tower goes down, and then you're buggered.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got a bit of context on scale here then. The other element you just kind of mentioned there, and is worth unpicking, is cultural safety. And I know when we talked at Southwest, you mentioned about the fact that some stories, say with your AR products and work you've done in the past, has preserved some of those languages. But then there are cultural norms where, for example, you don't want to replicate somebody from an Indigenous community if they've passed, for example. Can you start to unpick some of that, what you mean by cultural safety?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we're looking at how do we create culturally safe technology and how do we work with mob to do that, especially with stuff around AI, we really need to, there's kind of two steps to it, right? So we need to firstly demystify what technology or AI can and can't do. And the way that we do this is through free, prior, and informed consent. This is really huge though, because historically, free, prior, and informed consent has been done so poorly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and First Nations people globally. So getting that element of it right is, yeah, it's really critical. So what that looks like is being able to really clearly articulate what this technology can or cannot do. So what are the risks? What are the possibilities? What would be the implications for country, for culture, for knowledge? What are the intergenerational risks and possibilities of these things? And once you can clearly articulate that and talk to community about that stuff, that's only when they can provide their consent for or evaluate whether they want this piece of technology to even come into community. So like an example for that with generative AI would be, would you use generative AI to do cultural storytelling? Probably not, because we know that these large language models do not reflect Indigenous values or even the data that it uses to create those decisions are often research that's been collected by non-Indigenous researchers. So that wouldn't be a culturally safe tool to use for storytelling within a school context, for example, right? So there's that element of that. And then the second element is really around working closely with communities and clan groups to go through Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights, as well as what their cultural protocols are. So at Indigital, we have a standardized document. And when we go into communities, we go through that cultural protocols document with them. And it's standardized in the sense that it's just to start the conversation, and each community will have their own unique cultural protocols. So we facilitate that yarning to understand what are those cultural protocols, how do they apply to this technology, what do we need to be aware of when we're working in community, and what are some safeguards that we can develop that ensure that your cultural protocols won't be disturbed or affected or violated through the use of this technology and through this program. It's really important, and it's a step that's often overlooked, but it is so critical because particularly when you're looking at death protocols, so most communities have a death protocol. What does that look like with technology, for example? So a really good example of this is I was yarning with a Peta-Anne elder, and she was saying that she would really like to become an avatar, and she wants to be able to be there in future generations so she can tell off, a
Yeah,
few
yeah,
generations in the future.
that's so cool.
But also that her stories and her
Mm.
knowledge and that everything can be recorded, right?
Mm.
But what happens is that once you create that avatar, that piece of data exists way beyond what Arnie or how long Arnie will be alive for, right? That's just the nature of it. So what does that mean for death protocol? How do we use that? How do we create safeguards around the use of her image when she passes into the dream time? These are really important considerations, and they look completely different across clan groups. I know that for a lot of Darug elders, they have decided against becoming avatars for these very reasons of wanting to be able to pass into the dreaming and not have their images used or anything that would disturb that process. And so, yeah, when we've had those yarns with Arnie Mel in the Cape, we had to kind of sit down and talk to her about, what does that look like for you, Arnie, and who has cultural authority over your data in generations to come,
Mm.
and what is the consent processes around that stuff. So these are just some of those conversations that are like so critical, but they do often get overlooked. And I think sometimes when we're looking at developing and deploying technologies, there's such a rush for it, and that's why it's so hard to regulate AI and things like that. But those like conversations, those deep yarning, those safeguards need to be in place, because if we don't create space for that, for that deep yarning to happen, ourselves being exposed to things that aren't culturally safe and things that could even turn into like digital colonialism and stuff like that.
Mm. That's fascinating. I think it's a really important issue that people listening in would probably have not thought about before. And there's probably lots more of those anecdotes you could bring to the table. It's quite interesting how that actual parallel is also playing out in, say, younger students' use of Gen AI as well, because things are pushing through really, really quickly, like you said, and policy isn't really catching up. And schools are utilizing this technology. Really young kids are not really thinking about it. And that's not about cultural safety. That's about general brain development and learning and those kind of things. But it's got the same parallel. So when we kind of then looking at, say, data sovereignty for Indigenous communities, what does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to go back just really quickly to around what you were just mentioning there. Is it's really important, like, to balance the conversation between cultural safety, safeguarding measures, regulation, and everything too, and then not creating too much risk aversion around it as well. Because the last thing you want to do as well is create this
Mm,
kind of
true.
fear of AI, which I think is something that we always see. And it's like, the robots are going to take over. Don't trust it with anything. Say please to ChatGPT, otherwise it'll come back and bite you in the future. And we can't be creating that risk aversion too. Like, it's AI is a set of technologies. It's a system of ideas. It has the power to be something really beautiful, as long as those safeguards are in place and we do it properly. So I just wanted to preface that a bit. But
No,
with
absolutely.
data
Yeah.
sovereignty, yeah, yeah. With data sovereignty, for anyone on the pod who doesn't know what Indigenous data sovereignty stands for, it's basically the right for Indigenous people to govern and control data that relates to themselves, their peoples, lands, waterways, anything that relates to Indigenous people. And the reason why it is such an important movement is because historically, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, we are one of the most researched communities in the world. That research has primarily been done by white researchers, where they come into community, they extract information, cultural knowledge, and data, and it never gets returned to community. It often sits within the walls of academia and government, and there's not that reciprocity or two-way sharing of that kind of mutual benefit of what that data could do. So this movement is switching that on its head and saying that any data that relates to mob should be in control and ownership of that community where the research has emerged from. So it's obviously a really important movement. It's a really important, not just movement, but application within academia, within government, within, business, whatever. However, when you look at it within the space of AI, it gets really tricky. And the reason being is particularly when you're looking at machine learning algorithms, in order for the machine to be able to detect patterns to make decisions, you have to vectorize the data. And what that means is essentially data gets turned into ones and zeros. And through that process, you're essentially kind of stripping back the cultural identity and the nuance behind that data and the meaning and significance behind it, and turning it into a 1 and a 0. So it kind of challenges this idea of ownership when data gets transformed in that way. That's just a fundamental way of how you actually have to create machine learning algorithms. But there's not really a lot of safeguards in current practices for how to alleviate this issue, I suppose. There are some pretty cool things that people are doing around like cultural tagging of data, and this helps to kind of alleviate how that kind of identity and meaning can be stripped away within the process of vectorizing data. So there's a great organization called Local Context, and they work with Indigenous communities across the globe to develop cultural tags for their data, so that when you're either developing a algorithm, whether you're conducting any type of research, whether you're even working within archives or whatever, you are able to recognize that that's the cultural meaning behind that data. So there's ways around this stuff. I think ultimately it really comes down to seeing more representation of Indigenous software developers. But I think that also, I find that point personally, and I only speak for myself here, quite tricky, because I feel like it's like that rut we get stuck in when we talk about closing the digital divide, which is just around representation. Because yes, of course, that's important. We want to see more mob entering these spaces and deploying and designing what future technologies look like. That's absolutely an incredible and important goal, and we should be walking towards that. But it's also the way that we even think about technology in general. I feel like we need to shift that. We need to really decolonize the way we think about building technology, what an algorithm can look like, and start addressing some of our own biases that non-Indigenous people can sometimes embed into these technologies. Like we know that AI has had terrible cases of having racial bias inbuilt into the way that these algorithms are processing things. And, a simple example of that is looking at how some facial recognitions don't recognize Black or brown faces. There's been terrible incidences of people being racially profiled for crimes they didn't commit. And so we know that that's a possibility of this technology, right? And without having on Western belief systems built to algorithms, and even having large language models that aren't just purely based on white values and research, is incredibly important, because otherwise we're not going to see equitable technologies being developed. So I feel like it's the representation thing so important, but there's also this need to actually decolonize the way we think about it and create room for new ways of imagining what technology can look like, so that it's not just, again, prioritizing Eurocentric beliefs.
So I'm going to admit to being incredibly nervous coming into this conversation. And the reason I was incredibly nervous coming into the conversation is I'm a relatively recent immigrant to Australia. I moved to Australia 15 years ago. The Indigenous culture concept doesn't is not something I've ever worked with before, because I'm English. We're such a mixed bag of races and nations. Oh, plus all the damage that we've done in the rest of the world. So I'm coming into the conversation thinking, I don't really know what I'm talking about. I hear these concepts and I can't get my head around them. And then when you started talking about indigenous sovereignty and the idea that, that there are things that belong to certain groups, which I'd heard many times before and I hadn't really understood. Actually, what unlocked for me is I was thinking about, if we were talking to a company, like if we were talking to Disney, and Disney said, but our stories are our stories, or you're talking to a company, it's like our data is our data. We wouldn't think twice about that perspective. Like a healthcare organization would say, no, you can't just take our data and use it for other things. It's almost like, because it's people based, we've been thinking completely differently. But it's entirely reasonable that you'd have sovereignty over your own data, because we'd be happy to give it to McDonald's, but not to, the Gadigal people or whatever. I mean, it just makes sense now. You've unlocked something
and
for
it's
me.
tricky because in terms so Indigenous cultural intellectual property rights is not currently legislated. The work of Terry Jenke, who is an incredible woman who's been leading this work for decades now, and she's really been moving that conversation around why it's important. So, shout out to Terry Jenke. But it is really important, right? We have our own copyright laws, like Western copyright laws, that have these measures in place so that you cannot steal Disney's story, right? But we do not have the same for Indigenous communities. And a lot of the reasons why this can be really tricky in the legislative space is because not all of our knowledge is tangible. It's oral, and it's not always written down and recorded in the same way that Western knowledge has historically been recorded. But there's also other elements of intangible knowledge, and that's what makes it quite tricky to apply like a Western lens over, like a Western copyright lens over what constitutes Indigenous intellectual property rights, So it's different, and it's different because as an Indigenous person, we have a different epistemology to non-Indigenous people. We see the world completely differently. This is probably getting a bit deep and outside of the realm of
it's good. It's good,
technology, but like that will always come to head with Western culture, because you guys have a different epistemology and you see the world differently. So from the basis of our legal system to our education system to the way that technology is developed, we live in a Western society where we have been colonized, right? And that means that our legal systems, educational systems, technology systems are always developed with Western ideologies at the center, and non-Indigenous ideologies are not even close to that center. And we are starting to see shifts, obviously, in education. We are seeing more of a movement towards embedding Indigenous knowledges into these spaces. But fundamentally, the way the systems are set up are not set up for that different ways of knowing, doing.
Even if you embedded a curriculum inside it, it's not it's embedding the wrong thing, essentially. It's embedding some concepts, but not the actual process. And I suppose that's the same as Gen AI, right? Where Gen AI is essentially reading English-based texts, not soulful stories or the way the Aboriginal and Indigenous communities will convey their stories. Is fascinating. It's really eye-opening to understand this. If schools are embedding technologies like Gen AI in the curriculum, and they do have Indigenous students in there, what should they be doing to just at least be culturally sensitive?
Dan, I'm going to stop you there, because I want to reframe your question, because you said, what should schools be doing if they've got Indigenous students in there? But actually, it's what should schools be doing, full stop, isn't it?
Yeah, true.
How do we understand the context? Yeah, sorry, that was mean.
Well, that's a good point, because this is what this debate is about, isn't it? And this discussion to open these things up. You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's reframing the conversation.
I think ultimately, I don't know if this answers the question right, but I think we got to start is that Indigenous communities are not homogenous. There's not one Aboriginal person. So it's it's super important to understand place. And that's why we do things like an acknowledgement for country, right? But if you were a school working in the Blue Mountains, and how I think what's important is to engage with the local community where that school is placed, right? So the Gundungurra and Darug people. So you would be working with the traditional owners and elders of that area to understand what knowledge should be taught in the school. So instead of having this kind of blanket, let's teach about Aboriginal culture, it should be like place specific, and it should ensure that local knowledge systems are being shared in the way that the local traditional owners of that area have agency over what is being shared, but B, that they're also, building capability and relationship between schools and local communities as well. So that's something we're obviously quite big at with Indigital. And when we were still doing our schools model, that was what it was based at. It was all about being able to build relationships between schools and educators with local elders, and then for them to be able to be paid to come into schools to share their cultural knowledge. Because in the same way too, if we were to bring in like some fancy scientists, Western scientists into the school to do a demonstration, you'd be paying them quite the big bucks, and you should be doing the exact same for traditional owners, because the wealth of their knowledge is not less just because it's not recognized within like a Western framework. So I think that's like a starting point, is be local, engage with your local communities, and be able to be guided by them, because it's going to look different in any area that you're from. And yeah, I think that also addresses some of the fears people have in terms of being able to like ask questions. Like Ray mentioned earlier too, that sometimes you get a bit scared coming into conversations because you don't want to say the wrong thing. Maybe you don't feel like the subject matter expert, and you know what, that's okay. Unless you're Indigenous, you're not meant to. And even as an Indigenous person, I'm not either. Like my elders, yes, but not me. And so we have to start asking questions, because if we don't ask questions, then we create a divide between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and we will continue to kind of go down that historical path that we've seen where it feels quite segregated. Whereas if we actually just ask the questions, engage, put yourself out on the line or whatever, I think that's really, really important in terms of reconciliation. And also being able to hold space sometimes to feel uncomfortable. That's also part of truth telling, right? So yeah, I think like I encourage people to not feel like they can't ask those questions or to feel fear. Fear is just because you haven't been exposed to it very often yet, but the only way you can reduce those feelings and stuff is to just expose yourself more and to be open to learning and holding kind of space for it as well. So,
and I suppose this really got my brain kind of in a bit of a juxtaposition at the minute now, because I'm thinking in one hand I'm going, actually Gen AI won't and shouldn't, in this current form, be able to support Indigenous storytelling and all that, because it isn't the right format to do that. It's a different medium. But then on the other hand, then my brain's going, but all these rural remote communities that might need to do things different, or something to do with fixing something that's maybe not culturally relevant, but something to do with skills or jobs or future work, so they could remain on country but also work externally. It does offer them a lot of opportunity as well, right, in that angle. So I'm torn now between the kind of damage that it can do and the benefits that it can do.
Yeah, well, I think that's the thing, is there's always two sides to a coin. And it's the same if you're looking at how Gen AI could be used with non-Indigenous people too, right? I think the possibilities are really great too in a lot of ways. Like you probably wouldn't use the current ChatGPT to do any of the storytelling, like to do cultural storytelling, as we discussed a bit earlier. But if we were to develop like a large language model that was built off Indigenous data and had Indigenous software developers and community involved in it, then that tool could be used for lots of different things within community, whether that's storytelling or whether that's, however they wanted to design it for whatever their local context would be, and also what their community aspirations are. But I think there's other ways that we could look at how generative AI could be used in community. And I think a big one would be around caring for country initiatives. So whether that's applying like how AI could be used for like scanning country with like drones or LiDAR, or, you know, I'm not too much of an expert into that side of things, so I won't pretend to be, but even if it's just around like processing data and being able to interpret data, and how does that data then, like, that you're getting from, I don't know, your carbon farming effort.
A good example of that is like the work that we're doing in Cape York around and Kakadu. Just a couple of ones. There's ones we're doing with drone technology, like exactly like you're saying, to identify feral pigs who are eating turtle eggs off Cape York, you know, which is to do with sustainability in the Great Barrier Reef, and then also the magpie geese, where we're pushing that data into Indigenous farmers so they can see whether grasslands in Kakadu National Park are being eroded. Yes, amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very like similar to what we're working on with the mob up in the Cape as well, because these are like conservation areas that they really want to be focusing on. So in our final year, when we're up there next year, that's what we're going to be looking at, is how do we build that kind of AI capability using LiDAR and drones to be able to do some of that work. That data as well that they can be collecting can also be used to then inform things around like the nature repair market. It can be used to developing like community-led businesses. So there are so many opportunities as well for generative AI to be used in community that aren't, you know, dangerous or pose lots of risks.
And do you think it's got a role to play in things like language preservation? Because I know in parts of Asia, they're finding that large language models have got making a contribution to low resource languages. And I imagine in Australia, we've got that same scenario of languages spoken by a very small community.
Yeah.
Is there work going on in that space that you know
Yeah, there
of?
definitely is. I feel like Google's working on something at the moment around creating like a large language model to basically be able to use like Google Maps, and then when you're in a particular area, it would come up again in the language name. So there's definitely things that are working on that.
Yep.
I'm not sure how advanced that project is, but it's...
Yeah, I've definitely seen a case study. We'll find a link and put
Yeah,
it in the show
absolutely.
notes.
Definitely do that. But yeah, there's a huge opportunity for generative AI to be used for language preservation. Absolutely. I think it just needs to come down to who leads those projects. And again, like that concept of cultural protocols and data sovereignty being embedded into those works. Because then obviously, if you don't have those practices in place, who owns that data? Who owns that language now? Like, is it a big four tech company, or is it held within community? And what do those agreements look like in terms of data sharing?
That's a great point.
Yeah, it kind of leads me into something I wanted to yarn to you about as well, guys, which is I was recently up in Mapoon and I was yarning with Arnie Mariah, who's a Chewinji elder, alongside about 30 different mob from across 5 different clan groups up there. And we had recently gone and done some eDNA testing where we were doing water quality monitoring at 3 different sites. I believe all 3 were on Chewinji country, or maybe one of them was on another clan's country. When we were talking about data sovereignty and we were talking about data governance, because, you know, Mapoon has an incredible history of resilience, but it was also burnt to the ground in the 1960s to make way for mining. And they lost everything. So they lost a lot of, their books, resources. They had to completely rebuild the town on their own. So they are an incredibly resilient mob up there. And so when we have data conversations up there, like, mob are really passionate to make sure that like they know what their ISIP is. They know that they want to have these safeguards in place for how data is collected and stuff. So we were kind of yarning through like, well, what does that actually look like in community when you've got 5 different clan groups, multiple different PBCs, prescribed body corporates, and who's holding this data and where does it actually live and stuff. So when we were talking about the eDNA data, for example, Arnie Mariah was very passionate that that data set that was collected at Cullen Point, which is her traditional country, that can't be shared back with other clan groups because that's her clan's data. However, if the council, for example, or one of the trusts up there needed to use that data, she would be maybe okay, like for the Chewinji mob, they'd come together, they'd yarn, okay, we're happy for you to use it for this. But in order to do that, they'd have to establish like a data sharing agreement. So this was kind of some of the things that we were yarning through because, yeah, how do we manage those things on country? And that was something that they felt like they would be really, they could use that support in, is like, okay, well, I know I want to have governance over this data, but also this data could have really good impacts for obtaining funding for different biodiversity projects that would have to go through this council or like whoever it is. And so how do we make sure that I can still own and have sovereignty over this data, but we have strong agreements in place that means that this other organization can use it for the benefit of all of Mapoon. So yeah, they're really interesting conversations, and I feel like we get a little bit unstuck in terms of the actual application of Indigenous data sovereignty. And that's why I thought it was really cool when we were up there, because it felt like I was seeing it happen in action, which I haven't been able to see a lot before. So yeah, it was cool.
That's fascinating.
Just while you were talking, I was going back to my remoteness head on. So I asked Apple Maps to show me where Mapoon is, and it's 1 day and 13 hours drive from me. So that is quite some distance.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I bet it's so interesting to think about it in this way. And the more you unpick it and the more you unravel, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg here with these discussions. I was thinking about the work we did in Minecraft. We put the Maori language in there for cultural preservation and things, but there's so much more complexity to it than just putting languages into certain things or just preserving those languages. It's really eye-opening, and thank you for coming on this pod today. It's been absolutely fascinating.
That's okay. Thank you so much for having me, Dan and Ray. It's been really lovely to yarn through all of this.
I love it because you've given me a whole load of things that I can make sense of. And I think one of the things that I've realized through this conversation is AI could have some benefits and it could have some terrible downsides for Indigenous communities. And it's not just about the way that we think about stuff conventionally is like, oh, this is data or this organization data or copyright lasts for 50 years. We're talking about things that have got 10,000 years of ownership. And we can't just apply the mental models that we use today when we're thinking about things like that.
Yeah, and you're having such an impact on your communities and on country in Australia. So thank you so much for being on the pod with us today, Peter. It's been fascinating. And if you're doing anything else, then let's have you back on in a couple of months' time to see how things are going. And I'm sure people listening in will probably want to get in contact with you. If they do, can they connect in with you through LinkedIn?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just Peta-Anne Toohey on LinkedIn. So have a search. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.